This is going to be the first of a three-part series on rifle scopes. We're not going to talk about the high-end scopes. We're going to talk about the ones that normal consumers buy, the discount store scopes, the ones that you put on the 22. This is my Remington 597. It's a fine rifle. Right now it's sitting here with a very low-end scope. It's a BSA. Not that all BSAs are bad, but this is one of those that came from the bubble pack. You know, you see them on the hooks in the stores. It's an adequate scope to get by, but it's been on several guns. I'm not sure. It's been loaned out for a while. I'm not sure what's happened to it, but I'm very unhappy with the optics. There's a lot of distortion in it around the edges. It's just not a very likable scope to me. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this scope and what might have happened to it. You have to understand what's inside the scope if you really want to understand the scope. And you don't need a bunch of technical information on it. You just need to know how this thing's built, how you could damage us mounting it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this scope apart. Yeah, you can screw the bells off and stuff like that, but we really want to know what's happening in here with the crosshair and with these adjustment assemblies. How do these affect the accuracy of the scope and the reliability of the scope? So we're going to take this apart. Now, getting a scope like this apart is not pretty, and sometimes when you take it apart you can't understand how these parts fit in there. So what we really need to do is see like the adjustment assembly in place, what it's actually doing. There's only one way to do that, and that's power tools. So we're actually going to cut this scope up and we're going to look at what's inside of it. So I'm not going to bore you with that part. I'll take the scope off the rifle and then I'm going to cut it up, and then we're going to look at it and we can talk about each part of it. So when you go get your cheesy scope, or let's say inexpensive scope to use on your rifle, which is just adequate normally, you'll know what to do to protect that scope and make that gun shoot more accurately and have a, how do you say, happier with the scope for a longer time. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to examine the scope. So this is the first in a three-part series. And right now I'm going to not bore you with this. I'm going to go cut the scope up. I'll be back in a bit. Hooters calendar. The scope as it was disassembled. Here's the eyepiece. Here's the crosshair. Here's the end bell. Here's part of the Erector tube, which I had to push out of there. Here's the center part of the scope. And I left this together so you get a feel for what's going on here. And there's the front objective assembly, I guess it would be. And here's the front lens. Piece by piece again. The ocular assembly, the eyepiece, can be screwed in and out of the bell a little bit to get really sharp focus on the crosshair assembly, which was in here in front of the eyepiece. And so this can be screwed in and out to get sharp focus on the crosshair assembly. The entire bell can be screwed in and out on the tube to get sharp focus on your target. Now, this piece right here, this tube was pushed in here real hard, and that's the other piece of what they call the Erector tube or the guide tube, which is right here. There's lenses in it, and let me see if you can see that. There's a little spring on the side there, and we're going to exercise this here in a few minutes so you see how it works. But anyway, this part was really jammed in there tight, and I'm not sure it was supposed to be. I think it was supposed to be a little loose. or just snug, because this tube up here moves, and I cannot believe, as tight as this piece was jammed in there, I can't believe that this spring in there could overcome that pressure. So I believe that might have been part of the problem with this scope, is that somebody has over tightened the mounts on it, and it actually crushed the tube a little bit, and that's why this thing did not always take adjustments when you turn the turrets to adjust it. Okay, here's the other end of that, and you can see it's basically, you can just see the other side of it, and oh, you can see the spring maybe a little bit better there. It's on the lower part of the picture right now, and we're going to exercise those in just a minute. And up here is the front bell, or objective assembly they call it. In this case, on a cheap scope, it's just a single lens that screws in the end here. So that's how this thing assembles. Let's exercise the Erector assembly and or guide tube. I'm not sure what they're going to call it on one like this. I think because this is not variable power, I think they call it a guide tube on this one. So let's do that. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to turn the adjustments, and I want you to watch this tube inside move so you can see exactly what these adjustments are doing. Don't use an electric drill to normally do this. This is just for the purposes of the movie. So if you watch the center tube, come on baby, see it move? And there's the adjustment right down in there. It's pushing on the tube. Now that's pretty good, but the spring, if you can see it, here's the spring right down in here that pushes the tube back. So this is critical that all this move freely and that the spring be of the right quality and push on the adjustments hard enough, and this has to be pretty precision made, otherwise your zero is going to keep moving on your scope. So that's how that works. Here's the end of the tube that we cut off that was stuck up in the front or the rear, the eyepiece ocular assembly, and I believe this scope had been over tightened, and this was jammed, not allowing, because this is the other half of this, and I believe it was not allowing the tube to return, or was causing a lot of problems. Maybe you would turn it to return and then shoot a couple times, it would vibrate and return, but there was a problem there. So anyway, that's how that works. Well, it was fun taking all that apart, but what did we learn? We learned that the crosshairs are really fine, and they're up here behind the eyepiece. That would be second focal plane. If it was first focal plane, they would be in front of the adjustments on the scope. They would be farther up in the scope. First focal plane. Okay. This scope was damaged probably because it was over tightened. It was probably put on several rifles and tightened several times. So I believe the guide tube was stuck. That's why sometimes we adjust this, nothing would happen, because the guide tube was stuck in place. It wouldn't be allowed to pop back. Although the spring was pushing on it, you probably couldn't push the guide tube because it was stuck. Shoot the rifle several times, all of a sudden it would be kind of where we planned on it going. So you have to keep in mind that these scopes, there's a lot in it. This was a lot of equipment for, I don't know, 20 bucks or whatever it was. But it can't be the best quality equipment for sure for that price. When you tighten up on the scope with your rings, this tube is pretty soft. It's thicker than a beer can for sure, but you can deform this very easy. When these come out of the factory, these things are in perfect alignment. That's why you pick that scope up and you look through it and you say, wow, look how clear this is. Then you put it on your rifle, or a year later it doesn't look so clear. Well, a couple factors come into that. One is you may have actually distorted the optics in the scope a little bit by over tightening it. Maybe it doesn't zero up correctly, or it keeps drifting because that guide tube inside that has the optics is stuck. The other thing to remember is I've seen people actually take a scope, look through it, and turn these adjustments and go, oh, the crosshair isn't moving. Well, when you look through the scope, the crosshairs are always in the center of view. What you're doing when this guide tube moves is you're changing the optics. The scope itself is actually looking a different direction. So that's what the guide tube is doing. The crosshairs are not moving. The scope is looking a different direction. So hopefully we learned a little bit about this, and we'll consider all this stuff when we go to the next movie where we actually mount a scope. We'll consider how tight we make it and a bunch of other factors involved in mounting a scope. That's going to be mounting a scope for amateurs, not professional. I have professional equipment, torque wrenches and everything. But the normal guy that goes and buys a 22 or buys a low-end scope, or a low-end rifle rather, and gets a medium to low-end scope, he don't have that equipment. And probably 90% of the scopes out there that are mounted by amateurs, and that's okay. But let's try and do it right. So anyway, I hope you learned something by this. I hope you've seen something. If you have an old scope, instead of throwing it away, take it apart, you get some neat magnifying glasses. So, till the next movie, bye. Well, that was another good movie. The Hooters calendar!